more closely at what's been happening in the Marshall Islands, to look at their history, their people, the nuclear testing by the U.S. and that legacy, and then the lawsuits that the Marshall Islands have launched at the International Court of Justice, of how the Marshall Islanders were used as guinea pigs for 3 decades to study the effects of the nuclear fallout on human beings. And it's based on recently declassified U.S. government documents.
Substitute for them. We must find the answer to the problems created by the release of atomic energy. We must find the answer to the many other problems of peace in partnership with all the peoples of the United Nations. For their sake in world peace is as great as our own.
There was a time between 1945 and 1990 when the world was more divided than ever over the development and use of nuclear weapons after World War II. And in this time in history, many thought that society as we know it was on the brink of extinction. After the vicious, bloody, gruesome battles of World War II, 2 superpowers emerged from the ashes, head and shoulders above the rest, as far as military powers. The Soviet Union and the United States. Both sides was at war. Not literal war, but a Cold War, to where both sides stood at a standstill. The world had seen the destructive power of nuclear energy, with atomic bombs like Little Boy and Fat Man, literally turning human bodies into ashes and structures into nothingness in a matter of seconds. And in that same moment, the nuclear arms race began. Both sides decided to develop their nuclear arsenal, just in case the other side decided to pull the trigger. I know you're wondering, how does a group of islands, called the Marshall Islands, will play a part in 2 world powers fight for superiority? Well, the Marshall Islands consist of 2 chains of 29 coral atolls, and are located north of the equator, between Hawaii and Australia. The Marshall Islands have been occupied by humans ever since the Micronesians arrived in the 2nd millennium, but the Marshallese have lived there for thousands of years. In 1914, the Japanese captured the Marshall Islands and built military bases. During the Second World War, these islands, as well as others in the vicinity, became targets of Allied attacks. So in February 1944, it was no surprise that the U.S. Marines and Army forces defeated Japanese troops. Due to the remote location and scarce population of Marshall Islands, the U.S. naturally planned to test nuclear-powered weapons in the Marshalls. During the post-World War II period, the U.S. expanded their nuclear research and development programs. The U.S. then established the Atomic Energy Commission to monitor peacetime development of atomic science and technology. The fear of the Soviet Union increasing their atomic weapons and the belief that building up nuclear arms could help establish the U.S. as the top superpower contribute to this rapid expansion. The first testing series in the Marshall Islands occurred under Operation Crossroads. The purpose of Operation Crossroads was to investigate the effects of nuclear weapons on naval warships. Testing in the islands began at Bikini Atoll on July 1st, 1946. These tests would provide important information on the survivability of warships in the event of a nuclear war. They determined that soldiers on ships up to a mile away from a nuclear explosion would be instantly killed. However, with the detonation of IV Mike, the first detonation in the megaton range conducted by the United States, serious questions were raised as to the consequences of these detonations. Data on the shock, blast radius, and the fallout it produced were of particular interest, and the potential damage of these weapons in the upper atmosphere and at different water depths were unknown. The U.S. later agreed to a 1958 temporary stop on nuclear testing with the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. The U.S. later began using the atolls as a conventional and bioweapons test playground. For the next 18 years, the U.S. shot ballistic missiles at it from California and tested vast forms of bacteria on its islands and detonated a series of large conventional bombs in the lagoons. But there was one test more destructive and deadly than them all: Operation Castle. Operation Castle had the task of attaining data on the properties of nuclear weapons in the megaton range. On March 1st, 1954, the U.S. conducted its largest nuclear test, Castle Bravo. The explosion occurred at 6:45 a.m. local time. The bomb was 23,000 pounds and was rapidly adaptable for delivery by aircraft, and was thus America's first weaponized hydrogen bomb. Castle Bravo was subject to a massive error and miscalculation by scientists. The device originally planned to be in the 4 to 8 megaton range, but scientists were utterly shocked when the Castle Bravo nuclear test on Bikini Atoll unexpectedly unleashed 15 megatons of explosive force on the tiny island. Seconds after detonation, a mushroom cloud 4.5 miles wide formed. It ultimately reached a height of 130,000 feet. The explosion left a crater on the ocean's floor with a length of 6,500 feet and a depth of 250 feet, at 1,000 times the strength of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Castle Bravo's devastating effects were widely felt across the Western Pacific. Unlike Hiroshima's atomic bomb, Bravo was laced with plutonium, a more toxic element, and can be radioactive for 500,000 years. It can be hazardous to humans for at least half that time. It vaporized 3 of the 23 tiny islands of Bikini Atoll and created a crater visible from space. A fireball, nearly as hot as the center of the sun, vaporized water, mud, and millions of tons of coral, and turned them all into ashes by an incredible explosion, and exposed the habitat to radioactive uranium fragments. The winds changed during the detonation. Instead of being carried over the open ocean, the radiation fallout fell over populated areas. It fell into the atmosphere, appearing as ashy snowflakes. The fallout was composed of damaged coral, water, and radioactive particles. Children on the atolls within range thought that the powdery substance falling from the skies was snow and began to eat it. Islanders was literally covered with the substance until they evacuated 2 days later. All the medical side effects and experimentation of Castle Bravo nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll was all recorded by a study developed by the U.S. called Project 4.1. The government and mainstream historical sources point to the study being organized on March 6 or March 7, 1954, 6 days after Castle Bravo's detonation. Eugene Cronkite was part of the National Naval Medical Center and was officially named the project officer of Project 4.1. Cronkite was highly paranoid about the secrecy of Project 4.1. Today, scholars criticize Project 4.1 because researchers did not acquire informed consent from the Marshallese who participated. The team conducting the study did not ask the Marshallese for their consent, even explained to them that a study was even being conducted. In reality, the Roentgens in particular had been exposed to near-lethal doses of radiation. A calculation of radiation intake of the population shows that the Rapnanese adults likely were exposed to internal doses of radiation of 60 to 300 rem. Rem is the level of radiation that a human is exposed to. Doses at that level typically cause many kinds of psychological damage. According to the study, 5 to 10 rem can alter blood chemistry and cause genetic damage, while 400 rem will likely kill 50% of the exposed population. The islanders played with, drank, and ate the snowflake-like particles for days. They began suffering from nausea, hair loss, diarrhea, and skin lesions. Years later, the inhabitants of the island experienced numerous health problems, including birth defects. Beyond the atolls, traces of radioactive material was discovered in Australia, India, Japan, the United States, and Europe. Nuclear fallout spread over roughly 7,000 square miles. Bravo exposed islanders developed one of the world's highest rates of thyroid abnormalities. 1/3 of the wrong Japanese developed abnormalities in the thyroid, which controls physical and mental growth, and thus can result in some cases of Down syndrome and mental issues. Islanders complained of stillbirths, cancer, and genetic damage. Marshalls who lived in the northern atolls received the highest radiation doses. The doses received by the residents of the northern atolls were essentially due to a single test, Castle Bravo. They projected that 55% of all cancer might be contributed to the fallout exposure. The researchers concluded the United States paid the Marshall Islands $183.7 million for 15 years for injuries and damages resulting from the nuclear test. In 1983, the U.S. and the Marshall Islands signed a Compact of Free Association, which allowed the Marshall Islands to become independent in 1986. The United States remains officially responsible for the security and defense of the Marshall Islands. From 1977 to 1980, around 4,000 U.S. servicemen were tasked with cleaning up the nuclear testing site of Eniwetok Atoll. They scooped up the contaminated soil, along with other radioactive waste materials, such as military equipment, concrete, and scrap metal. It all went into the Runit Dome, which the servicemen covered with concrete. In the Marshall Islands, locals have a nickname from the Runit Dome. They call it the Tomb. In total, the crater holds enough radioactive waste to fill 35 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Most of its radioactive soil carried plutonium, an isotope that caused lung cancer if inhaled. Unfortunately, the government failed to build a concrete lining for the tomb, and the dome is currently threatened by rising sea levels. Sea levels have reportedly entered the dome, introducing the possibility of radioactive waste leaking out. The Marshall Islands government, which was saddled with responsibilities for the dome, is worried about the further deterioration could create an environmental hazard, and a typhoon can create an all-out hazard. Congress is planning to access the condition of the structure and develop a repair plan during the first half of 2020. Under a 1968 bilateral agreement, the Marshall people were permitted to enter the United States as legal non-immigrants. Now, amid tensions caused by lingering radiation and sea level rise in the Marshalls, it is uncertain where a new Marshallese government will renew a compact with the United States that has tied the two countries together for over 3 decades. If a new government decides to break the compact, the 27,000 Marshallese in the United States will lose their legal status and perhaps be forced to return to the island, racked by poverty, disease, and rising sea levels. The future of the Marshall Islands is highly unknown, saddening. Once a peaceful and fulfilling island before the Japanese came and conquered, is now a nuclear ticking time bomb. But now, only time can tell the future of the Marshalls. Thank you for watching.